The sun over the Spanish plains of Salamanca burned with an unforgiving intensity on the morning of July 23, 1812. The air was thick, not just with the shimmering heat haze of high summer, but with the acrid, lingering dust of a retreating army. The French, the masters of Europe, were running. Defeated the day before by the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Salamanca, the French rearguard was now desperate to put distance between themselves and the pursuing British. But among the pursuers rode a force that fought not just for victory, but for a home that no longer existed on the map. They wore the red coats of the British heavy cavalry, but their commands were shouted in guttural German, and their saddles carried the heavy, straight-bladed swords of the Hanoverian dragoons. These were the men of the King's German Legion. As the pursuit intensified near the village of Garcia Hernandez, the French infantry did what professional soldiers had done for decades when threatened by cavalry. They stopped. They turned. And with practiced, clockwork precision, they formed squares. The infantry square was the geometric solution to the chaos of the horse charge, a hedgehog of steel bayonets, 3 ranks deep, presenting an impenetrable wall that no horse, no matter how spurred, would willingly charge into. To ride against a formed square was suicide. It was a mathematical certainty of war. Cavalry could not break steady infantry. Major General von Bock, leading the heavy dragoons of the Legion, did not care for the mathematics of survival. He saw the French squares not as obstacles, but as targets. There was no hesitation, no pulling up to wait for artillery support. The dragoons lowered their heavy swords and accelerated. The ground shook under the hooves of hundreds of heavy chargers. The French infantry, confident in their formation, levelled their muskets. A volley of lead erupted from the square, a thunderclap of white smoke that momentarily obscured the red-coated riders. In that blinding moment, chance and ferocity collided to rewrite the rulebook of Napoleonic warfare. A dragoon horse, struck by a musket ball, did not fall immediately. Instead, maddened by pain and momentum, it reared and crashed violently onto the bayonets of the French front rank. The beast's heavy body acted as a battering ram, crushing men and snapping steel, creating a physical gap in the living wall of the square. It was the crack in the dam. Before the French could close ranks, the dragoons behind poured through the breach. The fighting transitioned instantly from a tactical standoff to a slaughter. The long, straight swords of the Germans rose and fell with terrifying efficiency. Inside the hollow square, there was no room for the infantry to maneuver, no way to reload. The defensive formation became a killing pen. In a matter of minutes, the invincible square was annihilated. But the Legion was not done. Fueled by an adrenaline that bordered on madness, they reformed and charged a second square, and then a third. By the time the dust settled, 3 French battalions had been ridden down and broken. It was a feat of arms so singular, so violently impossible, that even the Duke of Wellington, a man notoriously stingy with praise, was left stunned. But to understand the fury of that charge at Garcia Hernandez, one must look back 9 years prior to a different kind of defeat. These men did not fight with the casual patriotism of the British recruit or the conscripted resignation of the French private. They fought with the desperate anger of the exile. Their story began not in victory, but in the humiliating silence of the Convention of Artlenburg in 1803. At the turn of the century, the electorate of Hanover in northern Germany was the ancestral possession of King George III of Great Britain. It was a proud state with a professional army. But when Napoleon's Grande Armée turned its gaze toward Hanover, the political leadership capitulated. The Hanoverian army was ordered to lay down its arms without firing a single shot. For the officers and men who had sworn oaths to the king, this was a dishonor worse than death. The army was dissolved, the standards furled, and the soldiers sent home to live under French occupation. But in the shadows of occupied Hanover, a resistance began to stir. It was not a resistance of peasant uprisings, but of professional soldiers refusing to accept the death of their calling. Secret messages passed between former officers. Plans were hatched in quiet taverns. One by one, and then in small groups, men began to slip away in the night. They left behind their families, their homes, and their citizenship. They dodged French patrols, crossing dangerous borders to reach the coast, looking for transport across the Channel. They were heading to England, the only place where their king still ruled, and the only place where they could pick up a sword to reclaim their homeland. They were refugees, but they arrived with the discipline of veterans. From this gathering of angry, displaced professionals, a new corps was born. It would be known as the King's German Legion. The rolling hills of Sussex and the coastal camps around Bexhill-on-Sea became the crucible for this new army. It was a surreal sight for the local English population. Thousands of men, drilling with the precision of Prussian automatons, yet clad in the uniforms of the British Crown. But the King's German Legion was structurally unique from the moment of its inception. Unlike a standard British regiment, which specialised in one role and relied on others for support, the KGL was designed as a self-contained fighting force, a miniature army complete within itself. It possessed its own heavy dragoons for the shock charge, light hussars for scouting, solid line infantry for the main battle, agile riflemen for skirmishing, and its own batteries of artillery. They could fight a battle entirely on their own terms, independent of the larger army structure if necessary. As the ranks swelled with new escapees from the continent, the visual identity of the Legion began to take shape. To the casual observer at a distance, the line battalions of the KGL appeared indistinguishable from their British counterparts. They wore the iconic red coat, the white crossbelts, and the stovepipe shakos. But a closer inspection revealed the subtle marks of their specific allegiance. Their facings were royal blue, signifying their direct service to the king, and their packs and caps bore the distinctive cipher of the Legion. They carried themselves with a stiffness and a polish that often put the native British regiments to shame. While a British redcoat might sleep in his uniform and let the red dye stain his skin, the German soldier was culturally obsessed with turnout. A clean kit was a sign of professional pride, a remnant of the strict Hanoverian discipline they had brought with them across the Channel. However, it was the light battalions and the cavalry that struck the most distinctive figures. The light infantry, modelled closely on the experimental 95th Rifles, traded the conspicuous red for the dark, hunter green of the skirmisher. They carried the Baker rifle, a weapon of precision that required a thinking soldier, not a robotic automaton. Meanwhile, the heavy dragoons and hussars introduced a fashion that would eventually sweep through the entire British cavalry: the heavy moustache. At a time when the British soldier was clean-shaven, the KGL troopers sported thick, formidable facial hair that gave them a wild, martial appearance. It was a small detail, but it marked them out as other, as men from a different martial tradition. The internal culture of the Legion was equally distinct. The British Army of the early 19th century was a rigid hierarchy often polarised between aristocratic officers and a rank-and-file recruited from the desperate margins of society, men whom Wellington famously and uncharitably referred to as the scum of the earth. The Legion defied this social stratification. Many of its private soldiers were middle-class volunteers, merchants, students, and sons of minor gentry who had fled Hanover. They were literate men who kept detailed diaries and wrote long philosophical letters home. In the evenings, the British camps would be raucous with gambling and drinking songs, while the German lines would often echo with the sombre, harmonious sounds of Lutheran hymns and folk songs from a homeland they could not visit. This was an army of melancholic warriors. There was a pervasive sense of the exile's burden that hung over the battalions. For a British soldier, a war in Spain was an expedition. For the German legionnaire, it was a necessary step on the long road back to Hanover. If they lost, they had no country to return to. If they were captured, they faced execution by the French as traitors to the new Napoleonic order in Germany. This high-stakes reality fostered a grim, unbreakable cohesion. Their motto, Nunquam retrorsum, never backward, was not merely a slogan for a flag, it was a survival strategy. Their discipline was harsh, governed by the old Hanoverian code, which was often more severe than British military law, but it was administered with a paternalistic fairness that the British lacked. The officers, many of whom had lost their family estates to French confiscation, viewed their men not as expendable resources, but as fellow patriots in a shared struggle. This bond created a military machine that was responsive, intelligent, and terrifyingly reliable. By the time they were ordered to sail for the Iberian Peninsula to join Sir Arthur Wellesley's expedition, the King's German Legion was no longer a collection of refugees. It was arguably the most professional corps in the British service, a coiled spring waiting to be released against the armies of Napoleon. When the Legion arrived in the sun-baked, rugged terrain of Portugal, they stepped into a conflict that exposed the glaring deficiencies of the British Army. While the British infantry was stubborn and solid, the British cavalry was a source of constant frustration for their commander, Sir Arthur Wellesley, soon to be the Duke of Wellington. The British cavalryman was brave to the point of recklessness, often composed of fox-hunting gentry who viewed war as a grand sport. They could charge magnificently, but they lacked the discipline to stop. Worse, they had little concept of the unglamorous, sleepless work of outpost duty, the art of watching the enemy without being seen. In the early campaigns, entire British patrols would vanish or be surprised in their sleep, leaving the main army blind to French maneuvers. Into this tactical void rode the hussars of the King's German Legion. If the heavy dragoons were the hammer, the hussars were the eyes and ears of the army. They brought with them a continental professionalism that viewed horsemanship not as a sport, but as a science. While British troopers often neglected their mounts, leaving them with saddle sores and rotted hooves, the German trooper was known to feed his horse before himself and check its feet before his own boots. The result was a statistical anomaly that mattered immensely in logistics. KGL regiments consistently maintained higher numbers of combat-ready horses than their British counterparts, simply because they took better care of the animals. But it was on the picket line, the lonely perimeter between the two armies, that the Legion forged its legendary reputation. The first hussars of the KGL became the masters of the outpost. They developed a complex system of signals and patrols that formed an invisible net around Wellington's forces. A KGL picket was never surprised. They knew how to read the dust clouds on the horizon to determine the size of a French column. They knew how to light fires that gave no smoke. They knew how to freeze in the saddle for hours, silent as statues, watching the French lines. This reliability transformed the strategic confidence of the entire army. Wellington, a man who famously micromanaged his forces because he trusted so few of them, learned that he could sleep soundly if the KGL was riding the perimeter. He began to use them as the standard by which all other cavalry was measured, often brigading British regiments with the Germans so the former could learn the trade from the latter. The foreigners had become the schoolmasters of the British cavalry. This professionalism extended beyond tactics and into their conduct off the battlefield. The Peninsular War was a brutal conflict where soldiers often preyed on the local peasantry, and the peasantry responded with the knife in the dark. The British rank and file were notorious for plundering when discipline slipped. The Legion, however, operated differently. Many of them were educated men with a deeper understanding of the geopolitical landscape. They understood that the Portuguese and Spanish were allies, not victims. Records from the period highlight a stark contrast. While British units often stole food, the Germans were frequently observed paying for eggs, wine, and bread. They maintained the gentlemanly code of the officer class, even down to the lower ranks. This did not make them soft. They were ferocious in combat, but it made them respected. In a war where the guerrilla population could be as dangerous as the French army, the discipline of the KGL minimized friction with the locals, allowing them to operate in hostile territory with a level of safety that other regiments could not guarantee. They were soldiers who fought with a cool, detached efficiency, driven by duty rather than the lust for loot. They were the model soldiers of the Peninsular Army, a title earned not through flash, but through the quiet, exhausting perfection of their daily duties. While the hussars patrolled the horizon, a different kind of warfare was being perfected by the Legion's infantry. In the Napoleonic era, the standard battle line was a blunt instrument, massed ranks of musketeers firing volleys into the smoke, hoping to hit anything in the wall of humanity opposite them. But the King's German Legion possessed a sharper edge. The 1st and 2nd Light Battalions, clad in the same dark rifle green as the famous British 95th Rifles, These men were not trained to march in step and fire on command. They were trained to hunt. Armed with the Baker rifle, a weapon with a rifled barrel that could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards, 3 times the effective range of a smoothbore musket, the KGL light infantry operated in the skirmish cloud. Before the main columns clashed, these green-jacketed soldiers would dissolve into the terrain. They worked in pairs, utilizing a level of tactical autonomy that was alien to the rigid drill of the line infantry. One man would fire while the other loaded, communicating with hand signals and whistles, targeting the gold braid of French officers and the drummers who relayed orders. To the French, these German riflemen were a terror. They did not stand and fight. They fired and vanished, bleeding the enemy battalions white before the battle proper even began. The KGL light battalions were frequently brigaded with the British 95th, and among the army, it was widely acknowledged that the Germans were the only troops who could rival the Green Jackets in marksmanship and fieldcraft. They were cold, calculated professionals who turned the chaotic noise of battle into a silent, deadly science. But if the light battalions were the rapier, the line battalions were the shield. Dressed in the traditional red coats, distinguished only by their blue facings and the heavy packs of the German exile, the KGL line infantry earned a reputation for a stoicism that bordered on the unnatural. In the heat of battle, when British regiments might cheer wildly or waver under artillery fire, the German line stood in silence. It was a silence born of strict Hanoverian discipline, a refusal to show emotion that unnerved their enemies and reassured their allies. This reliability became the bedrock of Wellington's tactical planning. The Duke, a commander who viewed his army as a machine with many broken parts, found in the Legion a component that never malfunctioned. He famously remarked that if he had to secure a vital position or hold a crumbling flank, he would send the Guards or the King's German Legion. There was no higher praise in the Peninsular Army. The KGL did not need to be rallied. They simply needed to be pointed in the direction of the enemy. Throughout the grueling campaigns across Spain and Portugal, at Talavera, at Busaco, and at Fuentes de Oñoro, the Legion paid a heavy price for this reputation. Because they were trusted, they were used. Because they were used, they died. Casualties were replaced not by fresh recruits from home, for their home was occupied, but by desperate measures. They recruited prisoners of war, Poles and Dutchmen forced into French service who wished to defect, and eventually anyone who could hold a musket. Yet, remarkably, the core identity of the Legion remained intact. The veteran sergeants and officers, the old Hanoverians, maintained the iron culture of the corps. They turned a disparate mix of men into a singular fighting force that by 1815 was about to face its ultimate test. The war against Napoleon was drawing to a close, and the Legion was about to write its name into history with blood on a Belgian field. In 1814, the guns finally fell silent. Napoleon abdicated, and the great diaspora of the King's German Legion reversed its flow. After 11 years of wandering, fighting, and dying on foreign soil, the exiles returned to Hanover. They marched into their home cities not as mercenaries, but as the saviors of the national soul. Men who had refused to kneel when the state itself had capitulated. For a brief, shining summer, the Legion ceased to be a desperate band of refugees and became the celebrated core of a new Hanoverian army. They reunited with wives who had grown grey and children who no longer recognized them. The long nightmare of the Redcoat era seemed to be over, but history had one final cruel twist in store. In the spring of 1815, the nightmare returned. Napoleon escaped his exile on Elba, landing in France and gathering the Grand Army around him once more. The peace of Europe shattered in days. For the veterans of the KGL, there was a weary, fatalistic acceptance. They had spent their entire adult lives fighting this one man. Now, they would have to do it again. The order to mobilize was given, and the Legion said goodbye to their newly reclaimed homes. They marched west, into Belgium, to join the hastily assembled Allied army under their old commander, the Duke of Wellington. The army they joined was a shadow of the invincible Peninsular force. Wellington called it an infamous army, a patchwork of raw British recruits, untested Dutch-Belgian militia, and shaky contingents from German states. In this sea of uncertainty, the King's German legion stood out like a granite rock. They were the old hands, the men who had seen the French eagle fall at Salamanca and Vittoria. Wellington, desperate for troops he could trust, placed them at the very nerve centre of his line. On the night of June 17, 1815, the 2nd Light Battalion of the KGL, commanded by Major Georg Baring, found themselves bivouacked in a torrential downpour. They were stationed at a large walled farmhouse complex just forward of the main British ridge. Its name was La Haie Sainte, the Sacred Hedge. It was a solid square compound with a barn, a house, and a high stone wall enclosing a courtyard. To the strategic eye, it was a breakwater. As long as La Haie Sainte held, the French could not launch a coordinated attack on Wellington's centre. The 400 men of the 2nd Light Battalion spent that miserable, rain-soaked night fortifying the farm. They smashed loophole firing positions into the thick stone walls. They barricaded the great barn doors with farming equipment and furniture. They were riflemen, skirmishers by trade, trained to fight in the open woods and hills, now forced to fight a static siege defence in a claustrophobic box. As the dawn of June 18th broke, grey, wet and ominous, Major Baring looked at his men. They were cold, hungry and soaking wet. They were also vastly outnumbered. Facing them across the muddy valley was the main weight of Napoleon's infantry corps. The tragedy of La Haie Sainte began with a logistical oversight that would prove fatal. The KGL riflemen carried the Baker rifle, which fired a smaller bullet than the standard British Brown Bess musket. As the battle loomed, Baring frantically requested extra rifle ammunition. It never arrived. The carts were lost in the confusion of the rear echelon, or the requisitions were ignored by harried quartermasters. As the French drums began to beat the pas de charge, the men of the King's German Legion gripped their rifles, knowing that every shot they carried in their pouches was a precious, finite seconds of life. They were about to face the fury of an empire with nothing but their discipline and a few leather bags of lead. The attack, when it came, was not a probe, it was a deluge. Around 1:30 p.m., the massive corps of Comte d'Erlon, numbering some 18,000 men, surged forward. While the main body of this blue tide crashed against the British ridge, a significant portion broke off to engulf the stone walls of La Haie Sainte. The farmhouse became an island in a sea of French infantry. Inside the courtyard, the world shrank to the view through a loophole and the kick of a rifle stock. For the first few hours, the training of the Light Battalion held the enemy at bay with terrifying efficiency. The German riflemen, perched on the roof and manning the walls, did not fire in panicked volleys. They picked their targets. French officers, waving their swords to urge their men forward, dropped one by one, victims of the deadly accuracy of the Baker rifle. The ground outside the farmhouse walls became carpeted with blue coats. The French pioneers, axe-wielding engineers sent to chop down the great barn doors, were shot dead before they could swing their blades. The KGL were masters of the skirmish, and from their stone fortress they were bleeding the French assault dry. But inside the walls, a different kind of horror was mounting. The heat was stifling, trapped within the courtyard by the smoke of hundreds of rifles. Thirst became a torture. The pump in the courtyard had been destroyed by shellfire, leaving the men with no water to wash down the black powder grit that coated their throats. And then, the firing began to slacken. Not from a lack of targets, but from a lack of means. Officers ran down the line, their voices cracking with urgency, ordering men to conserve fire. Soldiers began to rummage frantically through the pouches of their dead comrades, scavenging for rounds. When those ran dry, they looked to the standard British musket cartridges, only to find they were too large for the rifled barrels of their weapons. In a desperate improvisation, men began biting the lead bullets down to size, jamming the deformed slugs into their rifles with rocks, ruining the rifling, but keeping the weapon alive for one more shot. By late afternoon, the situation had passed from critical to hopeless. The French, sensing the weakening fire, grew bolder. They clambered onto the roof of the stables, firing down into the open courtyard, turning the defenders' sanctuary into a killing pit. The KGL were now fighting a three-dimensional battle. taking fire from above and all sides. Major Baring, seeing his command disintegrating under the weight of sheer numbers and lack of powder, made the agonizing decision to withdraw. But retreat from a surrounded building is not a maneuver, it is a breakout. The order was given to abandon the post. What followed was a savage medieval melee in the corridors and through the narrow garden exit. With no ammunition left, the riflemen reversed their weapons, using the heavy brass-bound butts as clubs. Others drew the long, jagged sword bayonets, peculiar to the rifle regiments, and fought hand-to-hand against the French bayonets. It was a scene of visceral brutality, green jackets grappling with blue coats in the smoke-filled doorways, men screaming in German and French, dying in the mud of the vegetable garden. Of the roughly 400 men who had garrisoned La Haye-Sainte that morning, only 42 effective soldiers rallied around Major Baring behind the British lines. They were shattered, bloodied, and weeping with rage at the loss of their post. To them, it felt like a catastrophic failure. They had lost the farm. But in the grand calculus of the Battle of Waterloo, their sacrifice was the pivot upon which victory turned. They had held the strategic centre of the battlefield for nearly 6 hours against overwhelming odds. They had acted as a breakwater, disrupting the French formation and preventing Napoleon from launching a decisive strike up the centre road until it was too late. The Prussians were arriving. The line had held, bought with the blood of the Legion. The silence that fell over the field of Waterloo on the evening of June 18th was heavier than the roar of the cannons. For the survivors of the King's German Legion, the victory was absolute, but the cost was staggering. The 2nd Light Battalion had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Across the line, the heavy dragoons and the line infantry had suffered similarly grievous losses. They had helped to tear the heart out of the French army, but in doing so, they had hollowed out their own ranks. As the Allied armies marched on to Paris to occupy the French capital, the men of the Legion marched with the grim satisfaction of a debt finally paid. The tyrant was gone. The electorate of Hanover was free. The long exile was over. But with peace came a new, melancholy reality. The King's German Legion was a creature of war, born from a specific crisis that no longer existed. In the eyes of the British Parliament, there was no longer a need to maintain a foreign standing army on the payroll. The order was signed in London. The Legion was to be disbanded. The men who had fought across Europe, from the scorched plains of Spain to the mud of Belgium, were to return to Hanover, not as British soldiers, but as civilians or recruits for a new national army. The process of dissolution began in 1816, a slow, painful dismantling of a brotherhood that had lasted 13 years. The regiments marched back into Hanoverian territory, their reception a mix of joyous homecoming and solemn farewell. These men had spent their entire adult lives defined by the red coat and the rifle green. They had formed families within the regiments, their wives following the camp train, their children born under the British flag. Now, the administrative pen was doing what the French artillery could not, breaking the Legion apart. The final reviews were scenes of profound emotion. In town squares across Hanover, the battered standards of the Legion, flags that had been carried at Talavera, Salamanca and Waterloo, were paraded for the last time. Officers who had stood stoically while cannonballs ploughed through their lines now wept openly as the orders of dismissal were read. They were surrendering their identity. The King's German Legion was being consigned to history, its name struck from the active list of the British Army. The horses of the cavalry, the famous mounts that had been tended to with such obsessive care, were sold off or transferred to new Hanoverian units. The rifles and sabres were turned in. The red coats, faded by the sun and stained with the grime of campaign, were exchanged for the blue of the new Hanoverian service, or the civilian clothes of the farmer and merchant. It was a jarring transition. One day, they were the elite shock troops of Wellington's army, the safety valve of the British line. The next, they were simply men in a country that had changed while they were away. Yet, even as the units dissolved, the bond remained. The veterans of the Legion formed a distinct caste in post-war Hanoverian society. They were the Englishers, men who spoke with a mix of German and soldiers' English, who drank tea instead of coffee, and who carried themselves with a stiff, distinct pride. that set them apart from the new generation of recruits. They had lived a life that their neighbors could scarcely imagine, a life of high adventure and terrible sacrifice in service of a king who was a distant figurehead to many, but a father figure to them. As the years passed, the physical reality of the legion faded, but the ghost of the corps lingered, a spectral army of exiles who had once held the fate of Europe on the point of their bayonets. The legacy of the King's German Legion did not vanish with the striking of their tents. It seeped into the DNA of the armies they left behind. In Britain, the impact of the Legion was profound, shifting the very culture of the military. The British cavalry, once the domain of reckless amateurs, had been schooled by the KGL Hussars in the grim science of outpost duty and horse care. The fashion of the British Army changed too. The heavy moustaches worn by British hussars and dragoons throughout the Victorian era were a direct stylistic inheritance from their German comrades, a visual homage to the wild troopers of the Legion. Even the ethos of the rifleman, the independent, thinking soldier clad in green, was solidified by the partnership between the 95th Rifles and the KGL light battalions. The green jacket identity that persists in the British Army to this day owes a portion of its heritage to those German exiles who fought shoulder to shoulder with them in the peninsula. In Hanover, the returning veterans became the backbone of a new military tradition. They brought with them the hard-won experience of a decade of constant warfare. The new Hanoverian army was built upon the skeleton of the Legion, adopting their drill, their discipline, and their pride. In the center of Hanover City, the Waterloo Column was erected, topped by a statue of victory, inscribed with the names of the fallen. It stood as a permanent reminder of the sacrifice paid for liberation. For generations, the graves of legionnaires were tended with reverence, and the stories of Garcia Hernandez and La Haye Sainte were told in German schoolrooms as examples of supreme fidelity. However, the passage of time is a cruel editor of history. The 20th century would bring two catastrophic world wars that pitted Britain against Germany, shattering the old alliances and burying the memory of the King's German Legion under the mud of the Somme and the rubble of Berlin. The idea that British and German soldiers had once been the closest of brothers in arms, united against a common French foe, became an inconvenient, forgotten narrative. The accolades of Wellington, who had placed his trust so completely in his German friends, were drowned out by the noise of modern nationalism. The Legion became a footnote, known only to serious historians and regimental archivists. Yet, to look back at the Napoleonic Wars without acknowledging the Legion is to see an incomplete picture. They were the secret weapon of the Duke of Wellington, a force of such reliability that they allowed him to take risks he otherwise would have shunned. They were unique in the history of warfare, a displaced army fighting not for land or loot, but for a principle. They were men who had lost everything but their honor, and in defending that honor, they became the most professional fighting force of their age. The story of the King's German Legion is ultimately a tragedy with a triumphant ending. It is the story of the clerk, the student, and the nobleman who refused to submit to tyranny, who walked across a continent to find a weapon, and who did not stop fighting until they had walked back home. Their motto, Nunquam retrorsum, never backward, was more than a command. It was a description of their journey. In the smoky haze of history, if one looks closely at the thin red line of the British Empire, one can see the flash of blue facings and the dark green of the riflemen, and hear the faint, guttural echo of a German command, holding the line when all others might have broken. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.